Episode 63 of the Church of the Dark Ages, Part 1, Introduction. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great thought-provoking and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the history of the papacy at a2zhistorypage.com. You can connect and like all the social media from there and link to iTunes, where you can leave a rating and review. I'm glad you've come back to join us in this next series looking into the popes and Christian church during the late antiquity, early medieval periods. For some, the title of the series, The Dark Ages, might seem a little controversial. The use of the word Dark Ages for the 250 to 300 years or so after the fall of the Western Roman Empire is not often used academically anymore. It's generally not very useful to attach arbitrary names to create arbitrary historical epochs. Sure, the term Dark Ages isn't very useful because it gives many connotations that aren't completely correct, especially if you look at the balance of the greater European and Middle Eastern history. Overall, things didn't bottom out completely in places like the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Persian Sasanian Empire, Egypt, etc. The more commonly used name for this era of history these days is the early medieval period or early Middle Ages. But the early middle of what? We're back to the idea that the roughly 1,000 years between the fall of the Roman Empire in the West and the Renaissance in Italy was just a transitory time, a bullpen of history, if you will. The people and their actions in this 1,000-year period were just warming up to get called into the big game of the early modern period. I think there's little doubt your average Joe or Jane living somewhere in Western Europe in any socioeconomic rank had to have had the feeling their world was drastically changing around them during this period of late antiquity / early medieval period. The people living in that time period in Western Europe also had to have thought better times were well behind them. All they had to do is look at the ruins of buildings, roads, and the like that they could no longer build or even conceive how to build. Long-distance travel that was easy and routine for people's grandparents and even parents was almost impossible not too long after the Council of Chalcedon. The horizons in trade, travel, and communications for most people living in Western Europe closed in as the 400s turned into the 500s and beyond. That is a real difference in lifestyle and worldview. Just quickly, before we move on, I'd like to tell you a bit about the Agora Podcaster of the Month, Reconsider. The Reconsider podcast provides valuable context and background on the current events of the day. Unlike many other quote-unquote current events podcasts, Eric and Xander are not pundits. They're not trying to get you to think a certain way. They want to provide you with as much information as possible so that you can make your own decisions and form your own opinions. When a new Reconsider is released, it always moves to the top of my playlist. Now, where were we? There were many different beginning and end dates for different historical periods around the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, especially in church history. I've decided to choose the end of the Council of Chalcedon in 451 to right around the year 700 to focus in on for this series, The Church in the Dark Ages. The power of the Roman Empire in the West waned and disappeared, to be filled in by several different Germanic groups. Orthodox Catholic Christianity contracted by some degree, but began to expand again in those years, making up most of the ground it lost. Western Christianity and the Pope began to build the institutions and theologies that would be the foundation of church and papal history up to this day. An example of this is the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries. The actual investiture controversy is outside of the time frame of this series, but many of the issues that brought about the investiture controversy began in the 5th and 6th centuries. It's all connected right back to this time period. In today's introduction episode, we'll establish the major events we will discuss in this series. We'll start off with the aftermath of the Council of Chalcedon. The Monophysites and Miaphysites just didn't go away. They were the majority in Alexandria and had a strong presence in other parts of the East. Monophysitism wasn't as much of a direct concern for the West and the popes, simply because not many Monophysites lived in the West. That doesn't mean the popes didn't get physically dragged in some cases, into the controversy. The popes definitely had a say in what was going on for several reasons. For one, the popes of Rome wanted and needed to exercise their authority over doctrinal matters. Secondly, as time went by and Eastern Roman emperors tried out various different compromises between the Roman Imperial Orthodox Catholic Church and the non-Chalcedonians, the popes had to get involved. That leads us to another theme, the secular and religious authorities of the popes. In the West, as the civil government broke down, the bishops were the last men standing, if so to speak, and were able to provide some semblance of civil order and stability. The church in the West had to deal with the new reality that there was no more emperor in the West to back them up. Bishops in different parts of Western Europe found different ways to deal with this new reality. The bishops of Rome tried to keep the Eastern Roman emperor as their main man, but the relationship became more and more strained as events of the early Middle Ages unfolded. The barbarians were firmly inside the gate after 476. These barbarians, or Germanic groupings, were not Orthodox Catholic Trinitarian Chalcedonian Christians. No, they were not. They were old-school Arians of the theological line of Wulfilas and Eusebius of Nicomedia. It always just feels good to be able to bring up old Eusebius of Nicomedia again. The fact that the new leadership was Arian and not Catholic was another complication that played itself out in different ways in different places in the West. This is another theme we will talk about. Since different Germanic groups dominated different areas of the West and those places had unique demographics, which helped create different regional Christianities, Italian, Spanish, Gallic, Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and North African Christianity all developed their own local flavors and idiosyncrasies in liturgy, organization, chant, art, and that sort of thing. The Franks will be major players in this series. The Franks became a lifeline for the popes in Rome as their relationship with the emperors in Constantinople became strained. The Franks came into the Christian game differently than their Germanic barbarian cousins. The Franks converted to Catholic Christianity, which was a godsend for the popes in Italy. This conversion of the Franks to Catholic Christianity was great for Rome, but also complicated and innovated the church-state relationship. As I've said, different histories of the church end this post-Roman period at different dates. Some end it in the 800s. Others don't even start the early medieval period until around 700, more or less lumping everything from the time of Jesus up to 700 as the Church of Antiquity. For our purposes, we have to take the time after the fall of the Western Roman Empire and Council of Chalcedon in its own time frame so we can focus on the growth and development of Western Christianity and the papacy. Now, I think 700 is a great place to end this series because it marked the absolute rock bottom for Western Christianity. It really isn't going too far to say Christianity could have easily gone out of business in Western Europe in the years after 700. Western Catholic Orthodox Christianity could have shrunk to just an outpost in central Italy and parts of modern-day France, and that's really about it. All we have to do is take a quick snapshot of Europe right around the year 700 to get a better idea of what's going on. Let's start in North Africa. Years, really centuries of inter-Christian conflict and wars had weakened the economic and social fabric of North Africa to the breaking point. The coming of the armies of Islam in time completely removed North Africa from the Western European religious and cultural sphere. Islam didn't stop in North Africa, pushed far into the Iberian Peninsula, and even made a foothold in coastal France. Islamic armies raided into Italy and eventually conquered most of the islands of the Western Mediterranean. Looking up north, Britain and what would become northern France, the Low Countries, along with northern Germany, were in a full-court press from the Vikings. The Vikings weren't about spreading a religion or ideology, but they were not Christian, and at least initially had little interest in adapting to local cultures. In fact, the Vikings were cutting the heart out of Western Christian thought by killing their leadership and destroying the monastic centers, which were the thought leaders of the Christian communities. From the east, there were nomadic horse tribes constantly on the move, raiding and even conquering. In Italy, the Lombards were Christians, but Arian Christians. You can easily see how the future of Christianity in Western Europe did not look bright to someone who had the ability to see the big picture. The time from 450 to approximately 700 saw the institutions of the church grow and stabilize in an uncertain world. I'm very much looking forward to learning more about this time in history and talking to you about it, so I hope you will join me. As a matter of fact, let's just dive in right now. Leo was a major player in the tale of the Fourth Ecumenical Council. We know well about Leo's involvement in the Robber Council of 449 and the importance of his tome at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. We'll use the rest of this introductory episode to tell the rest of Leo's story, which will open the door for the next several episodes. Very little is known of Leo's early pre-church life. So little there isn't much to even speculate about or draw wild conclusions from. The Liber Pontificalis states Leo was born in Tuscany, but it doesn't mention anything about the circumstances of his upbringing or anything like that, which is a great shame if you ask me. It would be so helpful to know something of Leo's education or the nature of his early days. He sort of materializes as a deacon in the 420s. Even when he was born, the date is not known exactly. The best guess is sometime in the late 300s, but otherwise his date of birth is a complete mystery. Leo's education is also up for grabs. He definitely didn't know Greek, but he wrote Latin in a very clear and concise style. All that doesn't really help us to get to know Leo any better, though. As we progress in Leo's life, the image starts to become more in focus. The first we hear tell of Leo is in the late 420s, when he's sent on a diplomatic mission to Gaul on behalf of either the emperor or the church, depending on the source. The goal of the mission was to settle up and make nice with the military commander Aetius, with the goal of bringing him back into an alliance with the Western Roman emperor. Whether it was the Pope or the Emperor who sent Leo, he was completely successful. At this point, Leo could have held a few different job titles. He could have been a diplomat of some sort. It's also possible a low-level, non-ordained clergyman or possibly an ordained deacon. There's evidence for any of the above. Leo became archdeacon to Pope Celestine during the Council of Ephesus and was a critical figure during that council. What is not in doubt is the fact that Leo had a certain set of skills which made him a great administrator, politician, and ultimately a great leader. Of all the popes in nearly 2,000 years of history of popes of Rome, we're talking something like 260-odd popes here. Only 2 have been called the Great. Leo was one of them. Leo was not the Great because he was an incredible theologian. He didn't create a new theology or provide wonderful, insightful, new biblical proofs to prove, all these different things. Leo's greatness was in the way he was able to turn events around to his and the Roman Church's benefit. 3 events really made Leo's papal career, which lasted during the tumultuous years of 440 to 461. In the realm of church matters, Leo was centrally involved in the Christological controversies of the mid-5th century, including the writing of the Tome of Leo. Leo faced some of his most difficult decisions during this time. We spoke about all this in the last series, so we won't go into it too much. If you want to learn more about Nestorianism and monomyophysitism and all that, definitely go back and listen or re-listen to the West Meets East series. In church administration, Leo fought and greatly increased Roman prestige in the ongoing battles of the 5th and even 6th century. With places like Gaul, Spain, and North Africa out of Roman imperial control, Leo was able to solidify Roman ecclesiastical church power in all of these places. He pushed for Roman practice to be observed in the entire West. Bishops in Gaul worked to give themselves some independence from Rome. Ultimately, bishops like Hilary of Arles wanted Gaul, led by the city of Arles, to be a patriarchate in its own right. Leo was able to end those dreams, at least for the time being, and at the same time increase the claims of Rome to primacy over the entire Western Church. Leo exercised leadership and strategic vision in 2 major military attacks on Rome itself, the city of Rome. Leo was able to accomplish what emperors and imperial diplomats were unable or even unwilling to do. Both events involved direct barbarian military attacks on Italy and Rome. The Council of Chalcedon wasn't tied up in a nice neat bow in 451. Leo had serious concerns about certain outcomes of the council, especially in regards to the position of the Bishop of Constantinople. In 452, Leo still hadn't put his official stamp of approval on the council because of that one canon, Canon 28. While Leo was trying to figure out all of the theological angles of the Council of Chalcedon, he also had to step in to actually defend Italy. We're not talking about defending Italy from some heresy, which of course Leo did work against various heresies. We're talking about an actual threat of physical violence from none other than Attila the Hun. Attila had been beaten pretty badly by Aetius the general the previous year at the Battle of Chalon. Attila was down after that defeat, but not completely out. He came to invade Italy, but Leo went up to northern Italy, around the area of Lake Garda, not too far from Venice, to confront Attila. What happened isn't exactly sure, but Attila left. That's the end. Attila left. He just left out of Italy and didn't invade. Go figure. What the heck could Leo have done to make the biggest, baddest barbarian of the first millennium AD just leave? There's a couple of possibilities, as usual. One possibility is Leo provided Attila with an extremely large amount of gold tribute to leave. That's one possibility for sure. Prosper of Aquitaine, who recorded an account of the meeting just a few years later, like 2 years later, doesn't really say what happened. He doesn't give a very accurate or a very full narrative of the event. All Prosper says is Attila was so impressed by Leo, he just left, period. Much later accounts, like hundreds of years later, embellish Prosper's account by saying Leo gave a grand speech to Attila. When Attila looked at Leo talking, Leo was flanked by both Peter and Paul, and as in Saints Peter and Paul, completely decked out in bishop attire with swords pointed at Attila. Either Peter or Paul, we're not sure which, told Attila they would kill him if Leo just told them to. By that account, Attila took off, and that was that. Leo offering Attila a nice tribute to leave Italy is a very likely possibility. But there were probably a few other factors at work in this situation. At this point in 452, Attila was running out. running out of time, money, supplies, and the patience of his army. Many of Attila's soldiers were Christians of various stripes. Most of these soldiers, Arian or Orthodox, would have been hesitant to take on the most powerful prelate of the church and vicar of St. Peter and God. Add to that, the Emperor of the East, Marcian, was leading a large army behind Attila's forces. It's also very likely Attila was impressed by what he had perceived as Leo's magic as high priest of a very powerful religion. Leo moved a little closer to earning that title of the Great after staring down Attila the Hun. We'll end today with Leo's other great diplomatic victory. Well, victory might be a bit of an overstatement. Maybe it's more appropriate to say Leo used his excellent diplomatic skills to salvage the best possible outcome from the absolute worst circumstance. Between 451 and 455, a series of political events occurred, which seriously weakened Roman civil authority, but gave the church an opportunity to fill the gap. In short, the Emperor Valentinian III had the general Aetius murdered. Followers of Aetius had Valentinian killed. A usurper took over Rome. The Huns weren't a serious problem anymore because Attila the Hun died a few years back in 453. But the Vandals used the breakdown in leadership in Rome to attack. The Vandal leader, Gaiseric, or Genseric, he's called both, used a supposed offer of marriage to one of the imperial princesses as his pretext to go for a little visit, if you will, to Italy. The pretext was just so thin. It was as transparent as a glass window pane. Nobody was buying it. Gaiseric was going to attack Italy no matter what the pretext. In 455, Gaiseric and the Vandals left their base in North Africa, entered Italy, and headed straight for Rome. The usurper emperor tried to sneak out of Rome, but he was caught by the mob and killed. That left absolutely no civilian leadership to entreat with the Vandals. Who stepped up? Leo the Great, of course. Leo met with Genseric, or Gaiseric, and negotiated a deal where the Vandals would have 2 weeks of free reign to take as much stuff as they could from the city on the condition they didn't kill, torture, rape, or destroy any buildings. That doesn't sound like a great deal, but it was surprising Leo was able to get a deal as good as that from Gaiseric. You have to remember, Gaiseric was a staunch Arian Christian. Along with that, the Romans had absolutely no military option or any threat of force to stop the Vandals or even use as a bargaining chip. The Vandals were just about the only Arian Christian Germanic tribe that actually persecuted Catholic Orthodox Christians, but they didn't do that in this sacking of Rome in 455. One thing to keep in mind is, at this point in practice, there wouldn't have been a ton of difference between Orthodox and Arian. They had liturgies, priests, bishops, church buildings, and etc. We don't know the exact details of any of the Arian institutions, but they did have them. An Arian Christian like Gaiseric probably would have been awed to some degree by the majesty of Rome and the holiness of the successor to Peter and Paul in Rome, despite not being Orthodox. Plus, it was just easier to have absolute free reign to take whatever the heck you want rather than fight from street to street, burning and destroying. Think about it. Every single building the Vandals had to destroy was a possible loss of assets they could remove back to Carthage. Historians universally call this action in 455 a sacking or plundering of Rome. In my own uninformed, non-scholarly opinion, a sacking doesn't seem like the correct term because of the connotations of destruction of life and property. Plundering seems better to me, but doesn't even seem to be the right word either. The events of 455 in Rome were more like an asset liquidation by a corporate raider. Leo gave up liquid assets like gold, silver, statues, and other movables in order to save lives, immovable assets, and infrastructure. Leo came up with a unique solution to a really bad problem. It certainly wasn't ideal, but it saved many lives and kept the city somewhat intact. Leo the Great passed on in 461 after just over 20 years on the throne of St. Peter. Not a bad run at that time, for sure, not in the least bit. As bad as things got for the Roman Empire, they were about to get a whole lot worse for the popes who would follow Leo. Today, I'd like to give a huge shout out to our Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy. Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, and Dr. Jeff, and as well as our Alexandria level patron, Chris. I'd like to thank and express huge appreciation to 3 people who purchased items from the History of the Papacy Amazon wish list. Daniel, who purchased the Oxford History of Christianity Volume 2. That'll be very helpful for a few collaborations with Gary Stevens that we have in the works. Andy of Constantinople level Patreon patron fame gets a double shout out this time around for purchasing The Families Who Made Rome. I'm really enjoying this book. The great families of Rome will come around later in the podcast. Then they'll be central to the popes of Rome and are just a lot of fun to read and talk about. I'd also like to thank PD, who sent the Oxford Dictionary of the Popes. This book is a quick academic biography of every pope from Peter all the way to Benedict XVI, and it's just a great quick reference guide to help me get my bearings when I'm going forward. I really appreciate your generous donations. If you want to learn more, just put that one last item into your Amazon.com cart. Check out the link in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on our next step on our trip to the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.